Hi, everybody. This is lecture 10.2 on the prison system, which is the topic of the first chapter of Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? There's a little bit of review in here, so I'm restating a few terms that we talked about earlier in the course, but we do that so that we can put everything in context, which needs to be done, anytime you really start a new book. So, putting people in prison is the preferred method of punishment in our criminal justice system. But there are other ways to deal with criminals. Um, and there are multiple categories and many methods of dealing with people who have broken the rules. And in classic sociological fashion, we like to tag vocabulary words to things and categorize things. That's basically what us sociologists do, right? We put things that people do into categories. Um, so on the broadest scale, punishment can be categorized as either formal or informal. Formal punishment is administered by government. Uh, it is um, it is typified by trial by jury, at least in our society. You could also, in a different societal context, do trial by a judge or a king or a chief or whoever is the one that decides for that society what will happen to the person that breaks the law. And typically, in formal trials, at least in the modern world, procedures are followed, rights of individuals are respected, or at least we pretend that they're respected. In informal punishment, however, informal punishment tends to be administered by civilians. It tends to be more informal. It takes the place of mob justice often. It is less regulated and administered more unevenly. And um, often with these kinds of punishment, it is determined on the spot. We see examples of this in American society, and we can in the past, and we continue to see examples of this in global society in those areas that don't have regulated government or functional government infrastructures. Um, So the formal and informal are the two broad categories of punishments. Now we can talk about methods of punishment. One form of punishment that we can't really use in our society anymore is banishment or shunning. In this practice, the individual would be forced to leave society or the settlement. We can't do that anymore because just making you leave doesn't really make you go away in our society anymore. We have social media, we have means of communicating. So there's that. But also, it's not the punishment it once was. If you imagine colonial America, or if you imagine the Australian outback, if you are forced to leave your house, you probably would die, right? That is what banishment was. It was just short of actually killing you, giving you a chance of survival, but acknowledging that, yeah, this is basically going to kill you. Shunning is along the same lines. Within shunning, we still see this in isolated pockets. In the United States, we see this in Amish communities where the shunned individual is cut off from family life. Sometimes we see a form of this among various religious communities in the form of excommunication. Um, and that has the impact in older societies of also being similar to a death sentence, because if the doctor refuses to talk to you when you're sick, if the grocer refuses to sell anything to you, then you could very easily die. In the modern context, there are certain religious groups that also do a similar kind of shunning thing. That's more of a social ostracism, which is very unpleasant, especially if the individual grew up in that community. However, it doesn't have the deadly effects that that kind of thing once did have. Okay, so that's one form of punishment. Another form of punishment is corporal punishment. So corporal, same Latin root word as body. It's punishing the body. It's physical punishment. This can include things like in American history, tarring and feathering. Uh, in the Middle East, acid attacks. And in some parts of the world, and in back to ancient history, stoning, like you would find in the Christian Bible. That was a thing. People would throw rocks at somebody until they were either determined to be punished enough or dead. Tarring and feathering. It sounds like a kind of funny thing. It sounds like the kind of, I mean, there are cartoons from the mid 20th century that depicted tarring and feathering as, hilarious. But tarring and feathering was a wicked, wicked act. You would throw hot tar on the individual, like this guy here. You would throw feathers at the individual, and that would burn the skin and get the feathers embedded in the skin. Um, it would be very painful. It would get those feathers jammed in those wounds, right? It would get infected. Uh, this was a punishment prior to modern antibiotics. That kind of infection prior to the use of modern antibiotics could also kill you. So, tarring and feathering is something that is talked about in our nation's history, and that was a corporal punishment, and an informal corporal punishment. We hear of acid attacks in the Middle East, parts of Africa. It's kind of a similar thing to the American style tarring and feathering. Obviously, not funny in any way, and no context within that. It could be seen as humorous. Unfortunately, acid attacks often impact women who are accused of adultery. Doesn't as often impact men, and that can lead to some really wicked um, injury. Another thing to be brought into that with informal punishment is, especially regarding acid attacks, the decision is made on the spot, right? There is no trial, right? So because there's no trial, innocent people could be, these punishments could be inflicted on them when in reality they didn't do anything wrong. Regardless of your attitudes toward, human sexuality, those societies in which that do punish adultery in these ways may disagree with a lot of our modern ideas of what sexuality should and shouldn't be. Well, in many of those cases, in an informal setting, it could be that the young woman did absolutely nothing, but still is accused of these things, regardless of what the man actually did. It's a pretty nasty thing. Capital punishment, uh, in American history has taken the form of lynching, taken the form of hanging somebody, and in an informal setting, hanging them from a tree, and in an informal setting, through much of our nation's history, black men especially were punished in this way when they ran afoul of white people. There's a lot of race politics in this new book, right? And that's why it's relevant. And those were an informal kind of way of doing it. Lethal injection is the most modern capital punishment takes place via lethal injection, and that is the modern formal way in those places that still does it of killing people. And then we have imprisonment, which again is the most common form of formal punishment that we have in our country to this date. So let's talk about what exactly prison is. Again, we talked about this earlier in the course, but let's just remind us what prison is and what jail is. Just remember, jail is a short-term holding facility. This is where we put people when they're drunk and when they're disorderly, when we need to just put someone somewhere. Also, people awaiting trial who cannot make bond are put in jails, right? And a reminder, bond is the money you loan the state until your trial when you're out to make sure you come back because, you don't want to force your mother to sell your house if you get a bond loan like that, right? According to the Sixth Amendment, that gives American citizens a right to a speedy trial. Interpretations of that say that no one should be in jail for more than a year. That is generally how that's viewed. It does happen, but it shouldn't happen. I think the longest I've ever heard was maybe 2 years, but I'm sure longer exists. Prison is a longer term holding facility, and this is where, prisoners serve the majority of their time. So one of the first things that Davis brings up is that the prison system has expanded dramatically in recent decades, and there are currently 2 million people were in the prison system at the time of Davis's book. Uh, there are more in there than when this book was written in the early 2000s. Probably not disproportionately more. To the best of my knowledge, it's about the same. But that's a lot of people. That's 2 million people. I live in a city of 500,000 people. So my entire city times 4 would be how many people are in the American prison system. Davis points out, and remember, Davis does kind of have a personal beef against Ronald Reagan. But this is true. During the Reagan era, in the 1980s, when Reagan was president, there was a dramatic expansion in the prison population. This has to do with the war on drugs and certain, uh, admittedly racist portions of that. And also during Reagan's administration in California, 9 prisons were open. That's not just anti-Reagan. That is a tendency of politics of that era, right? We studied this earlier in the course. It's not just Reagan. It's not just Republicans. Democrats were doing this as well. Prisons uh, rapidly expanded during the 1980s and 1990s. Yeah, and just keep in mind, Davis has beef with Reagan. That doesn't mean her arguments are any less. It's just sometimes she brings it up a little more than other times. So that's a good basis for what I want you to do in this portion. Um, I look forward to our discussions, and as always, let me know if you have any questions on anything.